And since it's come up a couple of times, I also drive an electric car. I live in Ontario, so I received a federal subsidy, but not a provincial one.
Well, isn't that special?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Mr. DeMarco, I would just like to do a very quick summary of Report 7 on zero-emission vehicles, if I may. So the government's goal was for federal government vehicles that are net zero, or that are zero emissions, to be at 80% by the end of the decade. We are currently sitting at 3%, and you estimate that we should come in around 13% at the end of the decade, well below the 80% goal. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes, if the current trend of acquisition were to continue at the same pace, they'd only hit 13% rather than 80. Hopefully that current trend is not just a fait accompli, and they can change that, but it'll require a strategic approach for them to do that.
Okay, so let's start with this question. Where does the federal government get its vehicles from? Does it purchase them from regular car dealerships across the country the same way as regular Canadians do?
I'll turn that over to the department to talk about the internal operations. We were focused on the results of the program as opposed to the operational requirements.
So my colleague Nick Senos, Executive Director of Treasury Secretary responsible for greening government operations, will join us. And
so we buy it off a standing offer of PSPC, so Public Services and Procurement Canada, who buys it from the manufacturers.
Okay, very good. So I looked at the Statistics Canada website, and the uptake of zero-emission vehicles for the general population is at about 1%. That was at the end of 2021. So in the same ballpark as the federal government. So I would like to read a quick quote from page 11 of the report. So it says, "Not all of the operational requirements of the four selected federal organizations could be met by the zero-emission vehicles on the market during the audit period. These include trucks needed to pull loads for long periods of time and vehicles that can work in harsh weather conditions." So if the uptake of electric vehicles among the general population is about the same as the federal government, would it be reasonable to conclude that individual Canadians and Canadian companies that are trying to transition to electric vehicles are encountering the same challenges, and that's why they're experiencing similar results? Yes, Mr. DeMarco.
So, this relates to an earlier question about leading by example. We would expect, given that Canada is requiring all Canadians to have only zero-emission vehicles available for purchase by 2035, it's very important for the federal government to step up and lead by example in greening their fleet. If Canadians don't see the federal government walking the talk, then they'll be less inclined to do their part, especially when it comes to something like this where it's not just a hoped-for behavioral change, it's an actual requirement that sales have to be 100% electric by 2035 for light-duty vehicles. Yeah.
So another reason why Canadians may want to transition to electric vehicles is to avoid paying the carbon tax. When the carbon tax was introduced in 2019, it was at 4 cents a litre. Now it's up to 14 cents a litre and projected to increase to 37 cents a litre by the end of the decade. Now, I would like to read a quote from Yesterday in Question Period. Yesterday in Question Period, the Prime Minister described the carbon tax as, quote, "one of the most successful measures Canada has ever seen in the fight against climate change." Mr. DeMarco, in your audits, have you come across any evidence to support that statement?
So the theory of of the carbon levy, which is using a levy, a charge, to partially internalize what was previously an economic externality in terms of economic theory. That is well recognized as being a sound approach. We did our carbon pricing audit very early on to look at mostly design issues and coverage and equitability and all of those things that are still being discussed today. We haven't done another follow-up that looks at exactly how much bang for their buck they're getting out of the carbon price. But the theory of carbon pricing in economics is a sound one, so long as it's widely applicable and the price is high enough to induce the behavioral change that is sought. Thank you, Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, officials, I'd like to go back to this question of a third of emissions reductions by 2030 being accounted to under the carbon tax. Mr. Jimenez, when you said that, you didn't sound terribly confident. And I'm curious, Commissioner, have you seen the department's economic modeling? You deferred to them on the question of what the valuation expected in reductions is from the carbon tax. Have you been shared all the modeling documentation by the department?
We've had some documentation shared with us, but we wouldn't have a recommendation seeking more transparency if we felt that we were receiving enough. So there is, this plan definitely is better than previous plans in that it has more disclosure of assumptions, more details in it, sector by sector objectives. So that's better than before, but it's not good enough in terms of the level of transparency that our office expects and that I believe Canadians expect, given that they haven't been achieving results to date. If they were constantly meeting targets and it was just a track record of success after success, there may not be as much of a need for that information. But given the track record is so poor, then shining a light on the information behind these projections can only help them be better scrutinized and improved and course corrected before it's too late. So we are recommending greater transparency in the modeling and the assumptions.
It seems concerning to me that a marquee policy for the government really has no confident guess even as to what the emissions reductions are going to be in terms of our overall objectives. Is this not concerning that we don't have a clear idea of what we're going to accomplish based on what is a sound theoretical practice, but with the way we've seen it applied, particularly in rural areas across this country, and the discontent that it has led to for many Canadians who are struggling with housing and heating and grocery poverty at this point? Is it not concerning maybe to the Commissioner that we don't have that transparency and that level of accountability? Commissioner?
So it is a concern, and that's why recommendation 84 is there about making substantive information available, publicly available, not just to our office, but to the public. There was a question earlier from Mr. Backrack, I believe, about sectors accounting for the most increases in emissions since 1990, and oil and gas is one of those. This plan says oil and gas emissions are going to go down 31%, even though they've been rising from 1990 to now by 80 to 90%. That's a critical piece of information in the plan, that they're expecting a significant drop and that the trend line is going to reverse course. We would like to know exactly how they got there, and I'm sure members of the committee would like to know how they got to that 31%, because if they don't address the biggest sector in terms of emissions in a way that they can show their work in terms of getting there, then Canadians will not have confidence in the plan. So that's why I think transparency, an increase in transparency, will not only help in bringing more rigor to the process, but it'll also help the department in convincing Canadians that it is adding value and that they're getting value for money for all of these measures that do cost people money, that cost industry money, and they cost government money. So let's see what the show your work in terms of the.
I agree. Thank you, Mr. Olds.
And so I asked a question about the carbon tax, and your answer was that the carbon tax theory is sound. I would like to go a step beyond that into practice. I wonder if you could, help us understand how high does the carbon tax have to go before the government starts meeting some of its goals? Are we talking $1 a liter or $2 a liter or $3 a liter in carbon tax before we start achieving some of these targets?
So I can't give you an answer for that's specific to when people feel confident enough that it's worth their while to switch. The carbon levy is escalating, $15 per year to 2030. For different people, it'll affect people differently. When one person is ready to say, okay, I think it's worth my while, given I just commute, but I don't do long distance travel, they may arrive at that decision earlier, especially if there's a provincial incentive program in there. So I can't say what the number has to be to switch over everyone. It'll differ amongst provinces and amongst people, but it does have to be high enough so that the math works out, that someone will say, okay, it makes sense for me to do the switch. It's more costly for me to use an internal combustion car than it is an electric vehicle. But the exact price point, especially since it changes every year because it's escalating, it's too hard to say. There may be some modeling, year-by-year modeling that Environment Canada has about that. It would be quite different between, say, BC and Ontario, or Quebec and Ontario, but I don't know if they do have that.
The issue identified on page 11 where, the zero-emission vehicles includes trucks that need to pull loads for long periods of time and vehicles that need to work in harsh weather conditions. I can't imagine any increase in the carbon tax that would make up for these technologies that do not yet exist. And so does it really matter how high the carbon tax goes? If the department can't switch to electric vehicles that are capable of towing certain loads or electric vehicles that are able to work in harsh weather conditions, then what does it matter how high the carbon tax goes?
So there's impacts on the behavior of consumers in terms of choice of vehicles, but there's also impact on the market and manufacturers. So if there's certainty of the carbon price going up, there'll be an acceleration under economic theory in research and development and bringing to market new products such as 3/4-ton trucks or 1-ton trucks that we don't have right now. So it's not just a consumer, it's not just incenting behavior change in the consumer, it also is incenting behavior change in the market. For them to meet their target on the fleet, knowing that those specialty vehicles are not available yet, all the more important that for light vehicles, they switch over now because they're going to have to wait until later in the 7-year cycle to see if the technology is there for the bigger trucks.